Welcome back to the Responsible Raw Materials podcast, where we explore the people, ideas, and actions shaping a more responsible future for our natural resources. I suspect that many of us are lucky enough to have the likes of radiators and maybe even smart meters where we live. They're simply part of our homes. We install them, use them, replace them, and very rarely think about the materials that went into making them, where those materials came from, or what happens to them after we've finished with that piece of technology. For this episode, I'm joined by the fantastic Helen Woodcock, who has spent much of her career working in quality, energy services and sustainability, including within an organisation responsible for installing smart meters, heat pumps and other household energy technologies across the UK. And what I really like about this conversation is how practical it is. We start with a smart meter. Essentially, as Helen describes it, it's a board in a box. The box is a plastic box. It has an electronic circuit board. There's some copper and other metals and small quantities of precious materials within it. It's nothing particularly exotic to look at. But once Helen and her colleagues started asking where all of those materials actually came from, the picture became much more complicated. They could trace the supply chain back through manufacturers and sub-manufacturers, but once you got down to the metals themselves, transparency became much harder. Was that copper mined? And if so, which mine did it come from? Or perhaps it had been recycled, but then could you tell where it came from originally? And how confident can you really be when you're several tiers removed from the original source? Then we follow the same product in the opposite direction. When a smart meter reaches the end of its useful life, can we recover those materials within it? In Helen's experience, almost all of the meter could be separated and recycled, but that raises another question. If we can recover the materials, can we actually use them to make another meter? And that isn't always straightforward either. Some plastics, for example, if they're recycled, may no longer meet the fire performance requirements needed for a new smart meter. From there, we move into radiators and the growing installation of heat pumps. And this is where things become surprisingly human. If you remove a radiator from somebody's home, who actually owns it? Who is responsible for making sure it is disposed of responsibly or preferably recycled? Is it the homeowner? The installer of the heat pump? Perhaps the company delivering the heat pump program? And what happens when the recycling system makes doing the responsible thing difficult? While this is a very UK-focused conversation, the examples and the questions are applicable all over the world. As countries around the world electrify homes, install smarter energy systems and replace existing infrastructure, we're going to be putting enormous numbers of new products into people's homes, while taking equally large numbers of old ones out. So perhaps we need to become much better at asking two very simple questions. Where did the materials come from? And where are they going next? I hope you enjoy it. Hello, lovely Helen. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Very good. Now, Helen, I know that I'm in Scotland at the moment, and I think you might be in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
I am indeed.
But you're not originally from Northern Ireland, are you?
I'm not, no. I'm originally from Manchester. So I moved here with my partner to embrace a different kind of life. So yes, currently enjoying that. So hopefully it is slightly slower than normal, but the Irish really do live up to their name. But yeah, brilliant change in scenery and outlook.
Oh, fantastic. And now we actually met originally in Manchester when you were working for an energy related company that was one of the country's leading implementers of smart meters and different aspects. And I guess the reason why we're having this conversation today is one of the pieces of work that you'd done was all about looking into where all of the raw materials that were used within, say, smart meters, but also other things like radiators, where did they come from? And then also, how could we keep them in circulation? Is my memory correct?
That is correct as well, yeah, and I suppose it's all the way through from asset source to asset recycling as well, so it's actually where are they going after. So through the organisation that I was working in, we were responsible for the whole life cycle of that asset. So, for us, it was really important that we knew A, where it was coming from, but actually what was happening to it afterwards. And as you mentioned there about radiators, for some of the things that we were installing, we were having to take things out of people's homes. And it's then understanding the ownership of those assets, of where do they go afterwards, and actually, should we be taking responsibility for it, or does it sit with the homeowner? And if it does sit with the homeowner, how do we know that they're doing something responsible with it, and where does it go?
These are great questions. So let's start with the first bit in terms of making a smart meter, which I think to many people, actually, we might need to describe, well, what is a smart meter, Helen?
Smart meter is, well, you'll find them in your house. It's your gas electricity meter that you'll probably find underneath the stairs or in a cupboard outside your house. And it measures your energy usage, that is used within your house, or the gas usage as you would have in your house, and that's what sends the kind of data back to your energy supplier, so they know how much you've used and how much to bill you for. You also have the in-home displays, which you may have within your house as well, which basically is just a monitor, so you can kind of see in the house without going to check the meter what you've been using as well. So it's every single house has one. Not every house will have a gas and electricity one. They might just have one or the other. But I'd say every house has an electricity meter, I would say.
Be unusual for someone not to have an electricity meter of some sort, I guess.
Yes.
In the
Well, I suppose it's
UK
become
anyway.
yeah, I suppose it's becoming more and more, I say, apparent for people to be generating their own energy. But having a meter there means they can also sell back to the grid, so it's always useful to have one. So
So we're talking about a piece of technology that is in almost everybody's home, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure in many other countries as well. And I guess in my mind, this we're literally talking about a little plastic box with some electronics in it.
yeah.
What am I missing?
No, that's basically it. Is I would describe it as a board in a box. Obviously the plastic that the box is, or the box is made out of, has to be, fire resistant and stuff like that if anything happens to the meter. But it's as simple as that. There is no, magic in there. There is nothing hidden in there. It is literally just kind of what I'd say is electronic board, sealed within a nice plastic box. Gas meters are a bit more technical. There's a lot more that goes on within a gas meter, but electricity meters are very simple in their manufacture.
Oh, I'm so tempted to ask about gas meters, but let's stick with the simple electricity meters just for the moment. So simple plastic box with an electronics board sitting inside it. Where do they get made? Where do they come from?
So I'll take you back a bit. They used to get made within the UK, back probably 20 odd years ago. But as you can imagine, with people pushing down prices or the cost of labour and everything else within the UK rising, they've been kind of offshored to overseas to sub manufacturers. So they can be anywhere from Malaysia, Thailand, all the way out to Vietnam, but also in Europe as well. So Poland as well. There might be some manufacturing locations there. So far and wide. But there isn't many manufacturers that make them. There is only a handful, so you don't really have many to choose from. But they all make them to the same standard.
And I'm assuming that the companies, be they in Malaysia through to Poland, who are making the smart meters themselves, they actually purchase the components which they then put together to make the smart meters. So how far, like, what do their supply chains look like?
It gets woolly the further you go back. So we have the relationship with the manufacturer. They then might outsource it to a third party. We can go to those third party sites to see the manufacturer of them. But it's that manufacturing site which is kind of responsible for sourcing the materials to a certain standard and to certain checks. So the lead manufacturer will always do some due diligence on quality and everything else like that. But can you ever get full traceability to the exact metal that has been used to go onto the soldering iron? I would say it is very, very difficult. We never got that transparency. We always kind of ended up with a letter of compliance from the manufacturer to say they've been sourced responsibly. But it was always it's always that $1 million question. And then when we'd asked to potentially, is there any research that could be done, the cost that it would kind of take us to do that was quite large, and they kind of said that it would only be relevant for that point in time because sites change, minds change, everything else changes, and to be able to keep that traceability was actually quite difficult. So yeah, it was a minefield, especially when tenders came up, asking us these kind of things, and you can only answer it as honestly as you can, in a sense of it down to probably your tier two. To get to tier three and tier four would be very, very difficult.
So it sounds like you tried though, and you kind of had a proper dig to try and kind of wheedle your way into at least some of those supply chains. How far did you manage to get?
We managed to, as I say, we sat down with our tier two, and they then would show us what they'd done for I suppose their tier one, our tier three. Um, but it was only that we ordered it from here and it came from this location. We managed to dig to a point where we knew that it came from a vicinity. They weren't coming from other countries per se, not all the time. Their sub manufacturers would always come locally. But for certain things, you're not going to get it locally. There were certain items within that you couldn't mine within the areas that these places were. So we just had to, in some way, put a level of trust with them that um, they were being, sourced responsibly. And one of the things we did do is we managed to check, what due diligence they did on their supply chain. So we checked that it kind of met the same level that we did. So um, that's as far as we got. It was very desktop, very paper based, very, here's an audit that they've done. But it was, I wouldn't say cloak and dagger. They weren't hiding anything, but I suppose it was always just difficult to be able to
Yeah.
kind of do that proof point to actually get down to that level of detail.
So I guess just to make sure I'm clear on it. So a tier one supplier are your direct suppliers. Tier
Yep.
two are the people that supply that supplier. And tier
Yep.
three are the ones who supply your tier twos, who then supply your tier ones, and then they come back to you. So by the
Yep.
time you're getting to a tier three supplier of our simple plastic box with an electronic board inside it, what kind of components are those tier three suppliers supplying, if that makes sense?
It could be anything from solder that's going in to do the soldering. It could be there was always, within a PCBA board or a board that's in the box, there'd be little bits of metals that were kind of, I'd say, the nodes that were kind of doing some, I'd say, electrical magic. I'm not a scientist to be able to say what they were doing, but you'd be all sorts from, there'd be copper in there, there'll be different types of metals, all within the board, and then obviously on the plastics, wherever the plastics have come from, to be able to do what they need to do. So it's precious metals is a lot of the time on the board.
Mm.
Um, if you look in any mobile phone or anything, there's always a board in there that does its wizardry magic, and that is the precious metals uh, that are kind of on that board. And that's what kind of the bits that are always difficult to try and, I suppose, source where they came from.
And so by precious metals, are you talking things like platinum, palladium, things like that?
Yeah. Um, I don't think there was any kind of silver or anything in there, but as I say, um, there was definitely. I'd say I'm not technical, but it was kind of blobs of metal you could always see, and it would kind of do the different patterns of how the board worked. So, and you would see it being made. And that's the nice thing. A lot of the time is you could see the board being made, and so the metals are going onto it. It is just where those metals have come from.
Yeah.
They have one source of supply, but one supplier. But where that supplier, whether they get that themselves or whether they're sourcing it in to be able to sell on,
Yeah.
that's when it gets a web of different lines of and they must have multiple sources so we don't run out because as we said at the start, these meters were going into everyone's homes, so we needed constant supply. It's not like you can kind of say, sorry, that mine's run dry for a bit, we're going to need to wait until they've managed to find some more. we needed that constant supply, so that, they needed to make sure they had a constant supply chain.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, isn't it? So you could kind of get back as far as, okay, if we've now got metal arriving into the supply chain, but in terms of where that metal was sourced from, we don't know. It could be from primary materials, so yeah, being dug out the ground, or secondary materials, so it could come from recycling. So on the recycling front, so you mentioned radiators earlier on, but to stick with the smart meters, once they've come to the end of their life in someone's house, because I'm assuming technology changes or something
Yeah.
like that, what would you then do with those smart meters themselves? Do they then get recycled, or what happens to them?
Yeah, so they get sent back to a recycler within the UK normally, and they'll break them down, and to the point where they'll try and strip off all the different metals. Plastics will go into, where I think they normally said it was, bar some shavings, it's kind of either 100% or 99.9% of the meter gets recycled. So none of it goes to landfill, bar some stuff that, might go onto the dust on the floor. So, it all been split down and then goes back into its different streams. So, plastics could go into making other components, as you kind of rightly said. So, it can go into car parts and different bits going in there. Metals can go back into making, you know, other things that are made of metal. I suppose if you think about, from if we just go to a gas meter, for example, there's if there's any copper or anything that's kind of used within that, that could go back into making other copper or brass parts. And well, if there's brass on the top of the meters as well, they go into making kind of other nuts and bolts and things like that. So um we always worked with respectable recyclers that we knew that it wasn't going to just be split down and then they'd kind of sell it on to someone else who was then going to recycle it. They kind of did a lot of the recycling themselves. Well, they'd pass it on to someone who can go and do something with it. They were just basically the middleman who stripped it down to a point where they could send it back to the relevant recyclers. Now, there is some recyclers that can do some processing on site, so they can actually crush all the shavings of the plastic down, and they can actually not just have to sell the big chunky plastic parts. They've managed to, break it down themselves, which is brilliant to be able to see that kind of level of technology here within the UK and still being able to um, be reused. And that was kind of one of the challenges we had. Or one of the challenges I put to the manufacturers was actually how much of a meter can we actually get made out of recycled material. Um, for me, it'd have been amazing if a full meter where possible, could be made out of recycling. So it's like not like you're taking new to then get recycled. Can you actually make a meter out of an old meter? There was some challenges around that on the plastics for fire rated. Certain plastics, once recycled plastics, don't have the same fire rating. But they were looking at other elements of it, be it some of the metals, to see actually, yes, can we use recycled steel, for example, to go in there. So to make the products as, I suppose, recyclable as possible, but also out of recycled material.
So with that, did you then design the smart meters so it made them easier to be pulled apart and recycled? Or was it a case where you were just lucky that it's actually possible to pull apart something nice and simple like a smart meter?
Yeah, so the organisation I worked for didn't do any of the design. A lot of it came from industry standards. But I think as responsible manufacturers, the manufacturers were um, they wanted to be able to make sure that we could reuse the asset. Um, whether it's staying on the wall and going back on and kind of open it up and able to fix it. So I think it was, in some way, look of design that they were made that way. But I think they were always made so you could still get back inside them and do something with them. There was nothing in the industry standards that said they have to be of a certain recyclability, but I think they all were under, due to the world that we're in helping people save energy, they weren't wanting to add things to landfill. That's not kind of a game we're in. And as an organisation that I worked for, we wouldn't have been in for that, for actually, making a problem worse by, things going into landfill. That it was great that they could actually be recycled and reused. Maybe not in the same product, but at least they weren't just going to create a, a rubbish mountain somewhere.
Which is, I mean, I think a fantastic ambition to have for an organization is saying, well, this is a component part that our business actually relies on. Let's make sure we aren't generating all of this waste that, yeah, is then a problem for future generations and means we're missing a trick. So in terms of the recycling and the very active management of the old component parts, for example, coming out of the smart meters, is that something that your company had to pay to happen, or is it a case where you could make some money by selling the recycled plastic, et cetera? So did it cost, or was it a money adder?
Um, it changed as we went through because it depended on the cost of the materials at the time. So we had to pay for have them processed. But a lot of the time, depending on the cost of metal at the time, it might be neutral that the company got for recycling it, um, you know, would pay for our cleaning of it and breaking it down. So, or there might be an occasion where we might get a little bit back, but I think a lot of the time we broke even, which is great. At the end of the day, we know that the right thing's been done with the product, and we weren't. We weren't in the recycling business to make money. That was just the responsible thing for us to do. Um, and there was some products that you won't get anything back. So, it's you got a lot more for, I'd say, gas meters because a lot more metal with it than you would do for plastics. So, the gas meters were, I suppose a lot more worthy of scrap in some way, but you'd have to have a lot of them to be able to do that. So.
Yeah, so I can just imagine these sort of piles of gas meters, et cetera, with all of that fabulous metal sitting inside them. But I guess the sort of household piece of kit that's got lots of metal in it is, of course, radiators. So tell me about radiators.
So yeah, I suppose with the new world of moving into kind of a heat pump world, a lot of people, people are having heat pumps installed. A lot of the time they have to change radiators or take piping out, and we were responsible for installing the heat pump. That's what we'd gone in there to do, and through the contract. But obviously, as part of that, some stuff might need to be changed, as you say, radiators, piping and stuff. And it was a grey area as who was actually responsible for disposing of that. We don't own that asset. Um, we're just there to install a lot of the time. So, as part of that job, we might have to remove some stuff. And we couldn't find anyone to come and collect. It was kind of like there was the big recycling companies were kind of like, you need to, it needs to be a lot. They won't come and collect one radiator from a site. They'd kind of say, look, if we're going to do a drive around collection, we need to have, 15, 20, 30 radiators to collect. We're not just going to keep driving around the streets and collecting them one by one. The other option then is putting them in a skip. And then, how do we know if you're putting them in a skip, if the customer has ordered a skip to put the rubbish in there, how do we know where it's actually going? And I think that was always an uneasiness that we're installing something which is really great for the environment, but what's happening with the stuff that we're taking out? Where does that responsibility lie? We didn't want things to be ended up on, be it fly tipped because, say if the customer couldn't afford for whatever reason, a skip or couldn't get one, and they couldn't get them taken away anywhere. And I think it was always a worry from our side is actually, well, what's actually happening to it? And should we be taking responsibility for it to ensure that it's disposed of correctly? Can we put it back in the van and take it somewhere so we know that it's kind of they'd been disposed of? And I suppose it was just a grey area because it wasn't our property to take off site. So unless we got kind of written permission from the household, so yeah, it was somewhere where it was a complete grey area as to, well, what do we do? Who owns it? And if it does ended up being fly tipped, we don't want, from the point of installing heat pumps, you don't want bad press around all these heat pumps are being installed, but it's creating more waste. We want to make sure it's being done responsibly, and I think there wasn't an answer to it. It was still very much a grey area. No one was wanting to take responsibility for it at the time. It's the household's responsibility, and we've done our job. But it still didn't sit easy with me as someone who really wanted to make sure that whatever we've taken out and touched is something's nice has been happening to it, or it's at least gone to the right place for the right things for the processing of that to happen.
So what would improve, what would help, I guess, this part of the circular economy, which I guess you're trying to feed into? I mean, is there a need for better regulations or classification of waste, or what you can actually do with regards to this? I mean, what would have helped?
It'd have been clearer if the regulations were clearer as to who owns what when something's taken out. You know, if it is the customer. Um, but I suppose for me, it'd been waste firms that where you can actually, the scrap man will come and pick things up. If you don't have a local scrap man that's in your area, then that doesn't really work either. It'd have been good if some of the big recyclers offered domestic collections. At the moment, they only did commercial collections. So, if there was a way of having I don't know, like kind of a little fleet of vans just going around and you know where the install is, or at least somewhere where you can go and drop some of this stuff off. Whereas, you can go to local tips, but if you go turn up in a commercial van, they more than likely won't let you in.
Yeah.
Um, so, and if the person whose house you're installing it is only has a small car and they can't get a load of radiators in, so it's kind of let local skips, or tips allow commercial vehicles in for things like this because they're trying to do good, but they're not trying to dump, you know, their own waste that they should be paying to get rid of. It's taking something, you're helping the local community in some way. But there should just be more places where these things can go to ensure that things are happening to it responsibly. I think people want to recycle, um, but there is such a cost associated with it now. There's so many hoops you have to jump through to be able to do it that it's easier just to say, you know what, I'm just gonna put it in the normal bin. Um, because you don't know,
Yeah.
and you are challenged. There's so much challenge nowadays, and you know, a local. What I found here in Northern Ireland is the skips have been brilliant. They will help you. But there is always a thing in the back of your mind saying when they say, "Oh, you can just put it in that one." I'm like, "Yeah, but surely we should be separating that. Surely this should be going somewhere else." And even I don't know now. When you go to the local recyclers, where does it actually all go? Um, it would be nice to know that things are being broken down. Um, and I suppose as a domestic, it'd be really great to know from your local recycling so what's actually happened to it. Just so you know that some good is happening because you hear so much nowadays saying, well, it all ends up in the same place anyway. We separate it all out and it all goes to the same place. But I know it doesn't, but it does feel like that sometimes. Um, and I think that was always the worry with the radiators that if they end up in the skip, is anyone actually going to take them out? Or is it just gonna end up being put in the landfill with everything else?
So I find it fascinating. So what we've got here is we've got simple household bits of technology that are in almost everybody's homes here in the UK and in many other countries around the world. And when you try and go back up the supply chain, we can just about get those tier 3 suppliers, but trying to go beyond that is really, really tough. And then going the other direction down the supply chain, actually in terms of the just really basic behavioral aspects where somebody goes, this is just too hard. I'm just gonna chuck it, or whatever, rather than almost invest that time and effort in recycling whatever it might be. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I know that. So just across the field that I've got here, we're doing up my granny's house at the moment, and so we were taking a lot of copper piping out the house, and I was like, well, where's the copper all going? Because that belongs to us, surely, and I know how much copper is worth right now. And miraculously, the copper then reappeared in a pile. So this is a case where I'll be taking that down to the scrappy at some point in time to try and make sure something's done with that. But in terms of other things like the radiators, as you say, it's tough trying to work out, well, what do you actually do with them? But Helen, you've been saying that you're not a technical person. So what is it that's drawn you into this space of trying to understand the flows of material and the sustainability aspects of it all?
Suppose I came into all this from a quality point of view. Um, but I care about the world around me. And I'm a geek when it comes to, I like to know a full process of end to end, and I like to know where it starts and where it ends. Um and I think that's just where it got to. I've become very passionate. I fell into sustainability world. It wasn't something, I wouldn't say a path that I chose. I've always been probably sustainable in the sense of, I care about, as I say, I care about the world around me. But it's when I started asking the questions, and I think that's the things, I never took the first answer that anyone gave me of, well, that's just the way it happens. And I'm like, yeah, but why? Why does it happen that way? And I think that's where, I've came and asked you some questions, and it's kind of like, from you know, a raw materials point of view, we're all complaining about, we keep digging for things, we keep digging for precious metals, and keep going through that. And I was like, well, there's so much already out there. Why aren't we reusing what's already there? Surely we can reuse a lot of the stuff. And I always find that end of the supply chain, once you've taken it to that recycling point, I don't know what happens from it from that point. How do we know that it's going back in? Where does it actually go? I really hope that it's not being, shipped offshore somewhere else, to benefit someone else. And I think, there's so much good that can be done from the stuff. We're already doing quite a lot of good, but I think it our knowledge base stops at a certain point. And I think that's where it's kind of a bit like, surely we can make things from what's coming out and what's actually being made from it. Um there's been, there's a lot of stuff in the press, and I know, we've spoken about this as well, Sarah, before, around electric vehicles and the manufacture of them. That's another part of our organisation that I was part of, and we were looking at, implementing EV vehicles. And there's so much negativity in the press around, EV vehicles are worse than ICE vehicles from a manufacturing point of view. And that got me interested in as well. And I was like, well, is it? Are we just assuming it is? Has anyone really done the research to really look at it? Why? Longevity wise, could it be better? And I think we haven't got those answers, but there's a lot of assumptions being put out there. And I think that's, we take a lot in face value, and I'm one of them that I don't take my face value very often. I like to kind of make my own opinion and actually find the root cause of something, actually saying, well, here's the proof. And that's where I kind of got interested in it, and that's why I started asking the questions. And I could irritate a few people by asking the question. It's like, Helen, just leave it be. And I'm like, yeah, but I can't, because I haven't got an answer. And I think that's where, I'm still passionate about it today, in a sense of getting the right message out there. And there's so much negativity or propaganda out there saying for one way, and actually, what I think's missing is actually the solid answer based on research and based on knowledge. And in some way, I don't think you can say one way or the other until something's been in existence for a long time, as to which ways is one better than another. But yeah, that's kind of why I became passionate about it, and will always be passionate about it. And at the end of the day, I always live by a saying that I want to see the world not as it is, but as it should be. And I think the reason for that is we take a lot for granted, in a sense of, we just say that's just the way it is, but we can create change. And I think it's about encouraging the next generation. And I'm very much for creating a world for the next generation. We might not see the change today, but for me, the passion is making sure there's still a world here for the next generation to live in, and being able to thrive in, not just surviving. And I think a lot of this comes down to the stuff we put back into the world, and the stuff that we reuse and make available to people. And say that's why this topic in particular is quite passionate of mine.
So with all of that, is that a case of actually accepting that actually it might cost us something in the short term to try and get some of those cycles to happen? So as you've described, the ability to recycle a smart meter. So to start with, the company was actually having to pay for that to begin to happen. And then actually, as everything got a bit more efficient, you're breaking even. With time, there may be some income off it, who knows, with regards to that. Um, and then you mentioned electric vehicles, which I always find fascinating, because another one of the business streams within the organization you were working with was actually charging points for EVs. but at the same time, you were trying to electrify the fleet of all of the vans and everything for the engineers to go and install smart meters. So it was like the business wanted the need for EVs for the charging stations and then was going, but where on earth are we going to buy these electric vehicles from to electrify the fleet? So a really interesting kind of form of tension.
Yeah. And it was, and there was a challenge around the infrastructure. We're all being forced down the route of EV, but the infrastructure wasn't there, and there was also the pushback from a lot of the employees saying, well, they're not as efficient, they're not as good, they're worse for the environment, and it's you're listening to quite a lot of those stories, and they were very happy to go and install them, but they were turning up in a diesel van
Yeah.
to go and do it. And it doesn't, you can't do one with the other. And it didn't look like, from a branding point of view, it didn't look great, but it was, the car market was so much further ahead than the van market was. And it got challenging. And the cost was being driven up, and we were trying to drive the cost down, and it's kind of like it's actually cheaper to buy a diesel. So, but we were still trying to obviously do the business of doing the EVs, and it it was chicken and egg a lot of the time. And which one does come first? Surely the infrastructure needs to be there before you can roll the vehicles out, but I think they brought the vehicles out before the infrastructure was there. So they're relying on people to have drives to be able to charge them at home, and that was a big challenge. Is the fact of a lot of our engineers didn't have drives to park their vans on, so you know they couldn't charge them at home. So what were they going to do with them? So it was a battle, put it that way, a very
Mm.
difficult battle to try and overcome. There was government targets; they'd set their targets that we were trying to hit, but you can't. But they weren't doing their side of the bargain, and I think this is what has always been interesting: is there's always targets been put on our side, but there's not always they're not always being done on the opposite side as well. They're not always giving you everything that you can kind of play with.
Mm.
And I think that was always the challenge: is they wanted the results before they do any investment, and it's difficult to be able to work that way. So it's about finding that even ground, and in some way working together, and as an industry, it's about the industry coming together and actually creating change. Was that the right route? Is there a different route? And taking time to speak to some of the car manufacturers, speaking to the industry, the insurers. Actually, is there anything you can do from that point of view to make this supply chain easier? Um, because it wasn't a cheap or easy exercise to kind of go through.
So is this something about kind of really acknowledging the fact that it's a transition that will come in different phases, and in order to be able to get from A to B and then B to C or whatever, actually there need to be certain conditions met, or as you say, infrastructure in place to actually ensure that you can go through electrification of a fleet of vans or what have you. Is that really what we need?
Yeah, I think we always try and go from A to Z before you're doing the bit in the middle. And I think it's just doing, you know, do pockets, test it, try it. Does it work? Does it not? Tweak it, move on to the next. And I think we always try and go full whole hog without actually building in the time to actually say, does it work? Um, but I think there's a lot of investment needs to be done up first. And I think that's what a lot of organisations, and probably the government as well, need to, consider is they might need to people might need to invest first in machinery that may not get used straight away, but it will get used eventually, and to be able to help that kind of proof that kind of process works. Um, you can't bring if you talk about EVs, you can't bring a car into expect it to be able to drive the full length of the whole of England with no charging, or an occasional charging points. It's not going to work. So I think you need to put the infrastructure in there to prove it. Then more people will adopt it. I think if you make it difficult at the beginning, there's going to be more pushback. And that comes down to recycling. They want all recycling and stuff to happen, but you make it so difficult at the start, and you put so much red tape in it that people's not going to adopt it. So you know, they're not gonna want to do it. I've even heard now that certain councils are now charging for your bins, and it's a bit like, well, where's that stuff gonna end up? If people can't afford to to do it, or they're making the bins smaller, And it's kind of a bit like, at least give people an option, or an ability to, I think, in certain councils, they've now gone into like small little bins, but they only pick them up every other week. And it's kind of like, forcing you to really squash your plastics down and stuff, which is great. But once they get full, where's the overflow going to go? They're only going to go in the main bin. If that one's full, well, who knows where it's going to end up. So I think we just need to be practical. And it's got to be some kind of benefit for us to be able to, if you're going to want us to recycle from home, for example, make it easy and make the recycling centres accessible for everyone, that everyone can go and try and do good. Because otherwise, all anyone's going to do is order a skip, and everything will go in it, and the landfill gets bigger.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? Human behavior is so important in terms of this transition to a circular economy. And I guess also as well, it's not that we can't go back upstream in terms of the supply chain beyond tier threes, but because it's so unusual, it's still in almost like we haven't even reached teething stages yet. We're almost just
Yeah.
thinking about the teeth in
Yeah.
in the first place. Um, but I love your really pragmatic and practical examples that you were right in the middle of at your previous organization and what you managed to make happen. It's absolutely fantastic. Um, but now you're no longer there. Now you are in the lovely wilderness of Northern Ireland. And so, what are you up to right now, Helen? And do you still do anything in the world of materials, or is that something that's still important to you, but a bit of a side gig?
I'd say it's still part of everything that I do. So for me, it's the organisations that I kind of want to work with as part of what I'm doing independently is helping smaller organisations understand that, because I think the challenge that I had with the larger organisations is we were struggling with the smaller ones, and they didn't have the capacity, knowledge, or ability to be able to understand that element of, well, I've got no one who can understand supply chains, be able to have those conversations. So I want to be able to be there as a support for them to actually know, it kind of causing a ripple effect. If I can help them help their suppliers, then it will, hopefully they'll be able to go and help their own. So I want to be able to support organisations in understanding their own story, what their values are, but also make sure they're doing their operational, all their operations as good as possible, and that they have the knowledge of what's happening, so they're not just kind of pillar boxed in a sense of this is all I care about. Is actually them actually opening up slightly to actually say, well, what's happening before and what's happening after, because I think that's
Mm.
really important, and that's one of the things I've taken is, I could have very easily gone into my role and just said, well, I'm here for quality. Um, but I ask the questions either side. And then when kind of the sustainability lens and doing life cycle analysis, it's scary when you first start it, because it's kind of a bit like, knowing different weights of metals and everything else. But once you start understanding it, it makes it, you can ask better questions. And I think that's what I want to encourage organizations to do, is in some way, it might not have to change, but if they can ask the better questions, they can kind of influence behavior. And that's what I'm in the world of. And then personally, I did a lot of work in my previous organisation with Keep Britain Tidy, and litter, and I'm still very much an advocate for that. And I will, when I'm out and about, we have a camper van, so we always make sure we've got a litter picker in the van, so we go and do a bit of a beach clean whenever we go anywhere. Um, and it's sometimes, I always say, if you can't see it, you won't believe it. And I think it's very true. So if you can see someone picking up litter, you might encourage someone else to do it. You don't have to go and challenge them on it, but it's learnt behaviour. Um, as when I was in my previous organisation, we did a massive litter pick with over 100 young people. Um, and the impact that it had on those, they were walking their streets that they lived on, from their schools to a central point, and they were kind of like, they wanted to save the world. As much as these small, 4 or 5 year olds, they were like, is it bad people that drop litter? Why is this on the floor? Um, and the impact that it's had since is, they did a poster campaign. The kids did posters for their local areas about not dropping litter, the impact that it does. And one little litter picker, who was actually a staff member's child, now won't go out without their litter picker on any walk that they go on. And they pick litter up. And it's, yes, some people will sit there and say, well, actually, that's not our rubbish. No, it's not. But, things can blow out of trucks, things can blow. But if we can all make a difference, and I think that's what, I'm here to do, is demonstrate that every small action can make a difference. And as I say, if one person sees you doing it, it might encourage them to go and do it as well. And that goes from everything from picking up litter, but also through to business as well. And if I can just encourage people to ask questions and being more inquisitive about things, then my job's done, really.
Amazing, Helen. I think that is an amazing place to conclude our chat today. So thank you so, so much. That was absolutely brilliant.
Not a problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So that was my conversation with Helen. And I think what I found most interesting was how quickly something apparently very simple becomes complicated once you start asking where everything came from and where it goes next. Take a smart meter. On the face of it, it's really just a fairly modest piece of household technology. A plastic casing containing an electronic board and a collection of metals and other materials. But follow those materials backwards through the supply chain and, as Helen found, things start to become rather woolly. You may know who manufactured the meter. You may know who supplied the circuit board. You may even be able to trace some of the components another tier or two further back. But eventually, you reach the raw materials themselves, and it's usually around this point that the visibility begins to disappear. You might know that there is copper in the product. You also may know that there are other metals on the circuit board. However, was that copper mined recently? Did it come from recycled material instead? If so, which countries did it come from? Which mines? Which processing plants? Helen and her colleagues genuinely tried to answer those questions. And what struck me was that the difficulty wasn't necessarily that anybody was deliberately hiding information. It was just that the supply chain was complicated. Suppliers changed, sources changed, manufacturing sites changed, and keeping a continuous line of traceability all the way back to the original raw material was difficult and potentially incredibly expensive. Then we turned the whole thing around and followed the smart meter in the other direction. And actually, there was some really very encouraging news. The meters Helen worked with could be dismantled and almost entirely separated into different recycling streams, plastics, metals, and other components, rather than simply being sent to landfill. But even there, the circular economy isn't quite as circular as we might like. One of Helen's questions to manufacturers was whether you could make a new meter from an old meter. Could the recovered plastic go back into a new casing? Could recycled steel and other metals be used in the next generation of products? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And something as straightforward and as important as the fire rating of a recycled plastic can act as the prevention of it being used again for exactly the same purpose. These are really important things to know about. Then we got on to radiators. And I think that example illustrates another part of the problem beautifully. A radiator contains valuable metal, and there are well-established ways of recycling metal. Yet, if you're replacing one radiator in one house, suddenly the economics and logistics become incredibly awkward. A large recycling company may not want to send a vehicle to collect a single radiator. The installer may not legally own it, and the homeowner may not have a vehicle capable of taking it to a recycling centre. And even a commercial van may not be allowed into the local household waste site. At that point, something which is technically very recyclable can end up in the wrong place simply because the system around it makes recycling difficult. I thought Helen made a very good point about this. People often do want to do the responsible thing, but we need to make the responsible thing reasonably easy to do. If recycling requires too much time, too much money, or too many hoops to jump through, human behaviour inevitably becomes part of the problem. And perhaps that's what I'll take most from this episode. The circular economy isn't just a materials challenge. It's a supply chain challenge, a design challenge, a logistics challenge, a regulatory challenge, and very definitely a human behaviour challenge. Helen also has a wonderfully persistent habit of asking, yes, but why? Why is that the way the supply chain works? Why can't we trace the material further? And why can't we reuse what we already have? Why does responsibility suddenly become unclear when a product comes out of somebody's home? That sort of questioning matters because there are already vast quantities of copper, steel, plastics, and other valuable materials sitting inside the technology and infrastructure all around us. The challenge isn't simply about extracting more, it's understanding what we already have, keeping those materials useful for as long as possible, and making it much easier for them to find their way back into circulation when that first use comes to an end. And although Helen's examples come very much from the UK, I think that question is relevant almost everywhere. As more homes around the world become electrified and connected, perhaps we need to think just as carefully about the material flows behind that transition as we do about the technology itself. Thanks very much to Helen for joining me. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Want to find out more? We've got hundreds of free-to-access videos, resources, and insights on our website. Visit www.responsiblerawmaterials.com to explore insights from an ever-growing list of diverse voices from across industry, academia, government, civil society, and beyond.